Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Goddard, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here tonight and to introduce our speaker. This evening's lecturer is Eric Maskin, who's Albert Hirschmann Professor in the School of Social Sciences here at the Institute. Eric obtained his bachelor's degree and his PhD from Harvard in applied mathematics in 1976, and he spent the next year as a research fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge, before returning to the other Cambridge as assistant professor of economics at MIT. He progressed through to full professor in 1981 and then left in 1985 to join the faculty of Harvard as professor of economics, becoming Lewis Berkman Professor in 1997, and in 2000 he joined the faculty here. Eric has very many distinctions, and it would take too long to list them all. He's a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, corresponding Fellow of the British Academy, and I'm proud to say an Honorary Fellow of my college in Cambridge, St. John's. Today, Eric's topic is, why haven't global markets reduced inequality? Eric.
Specifically, I mean two things. First, the dramatic increase in trade of goods and services between countries, and we can all think of examples where this phenomenon has touched our everyday lives. For example, just look at your local supermarket and you'll see fruit and vegetables from all around the world. I think it's now fair to say that grapes are never out of season. But I also mean by globalization the idea that production itself occurs across international lines. And again, an everyday example of this sort of thing would be the fact that when you call your local bank, very often, you'll get not someone at the bank at the other end of the line, but someone in India. And this is just one small example of the internationalization of production. Now, there are many causes behind this recent globalization. Probably the three main factors have been a decline in transportation costs. It's actually cheaper to get these goods from one place to another. But also, of course, the advent of electronic communication so that both production and trade can be coordinated cheaply. And then finally, there have been a number of negotiated facilitators of globalization, in particular the removal of trade barriers through treaties such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, GATT, and others. Globalization has come with many promises, and among them is the promise that it will bring prosperity and growth to poor countries. And on this count, I think it's fair to say that there's been some success. In the case of China and India, quite spectacular success. But another promise that it has often been made on behalf of globalization is the idea that the gap between the rich and poor, the haves and the have-nots in developing countries, will be reduced. And here, I don't think globalization has been nearly what it was promised to be. Let me just give an example. Our neighbor Mexico joined GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, about 20 years ago, and within just a few years, tariffs had fallen by 50%, as Mexico had promised to do. Mexico was properly globalized in the sense that foreign capital came in. In fact, it quadrupled within a matter of 3 or 4 years. And as a result of all of this, many people prospered. In particular, white-collar wages rose quite dramatically by 13%, again within less than half a dozen years. But at the same time, blue-collar wages, wages at the lower end, actually fell. So inequality increased in Mexico, contrary to what had been hoped. And I'm picking on Mexico not because it's anything special, but because it's probably a source of more accurate data than for many other countries. But pretty much the same story could be told for other countries in Latin America and Africa, some in the Far East as well. Well, we might ask, why should we care about reducing inequality in developing countries? There are 3 possible answers that I might offer. One is the moral argument, the idea that we simply do not like to see huge disparities of wealth. But even if you don't accept this argument, there's the idea that when we're talking about poor people in developing countries, we're talking about some of the most destitute people in the world. And even if we don't care about inequality per se, we might care about ensuring that they don't continue to live in abject poverty. And globalization was put forth as a possible remedy against poverty. And the third argument is the idea that large disparities of income promote instability. And therefore, even if we don't care about the other arguments, in order to have a stable world, a stable environment, we want to do something about the gap between rich and poor. This is an argument which has appealed particularly to the government of China, China is a country which has experienced a very dramatic increase in inequality in recent years. Now, I started by saying that globalization had promised a decline in inequality between rich and poor. Is the fact that that did not happen a surprise? Well, I think it is fair to say that it is a surprise because it actually contradicts the most secure theory that we in economics have for explaining international trade patterns, and that's the theory of comparative advantage. This is a theory that has been around for a long time. It was given its original form more than 200 years ago by the British economist David Ricardo, and it's been refined many times since then. The 20th century culmination is in the so-called Heckscher-Ohlin theory. And by the standards of economics, it's been a very successful theory in that it has done a good job of explaining many historical trade patterns. Natty Seiberg gave a talk here a couple of weeks ago on the standard theory of particle physics, where he said that this is a theory that is accurate to 11 decimal places. No economic theory is accurate to 11 decimal places. In fact, we're often happy if we get things right to the right order of magnitude. But the theory of comparative advantage has at least generally done that. And as I'll show you in a few minutes, it predicts quite unambiguously that free trade should reduce inequality in poor countries. So let me explain why that's the case. I'll give you the outlines of the theory of comparative advantage? Well, any theory of trade has to begin by addressing the question, why is it that countries trade with one another? And the theory of comparative advantage says that they trade with one another because different countries are different. If we were all the same, there would be no gains from trade. But it goes farther than that. It argues that we trade with one another because of differences in factors of production. What is a factor of production? It's simply an input into the production process. So, for example, labor is a factor of production, and labor itself can be further subdivided into labor of different skill levels, high-skill workers, low-skill workers. Capital is a factor of production, and capital as well can be subdivided into machinery, technology, tools, and so on. And then natural resources like land can be thought of as factors of production. For the purpose of this talk tonight, I'm going to concentrate on labor, and in particular on high-skill workers and low-skill workers. Let's do a thought experiment and compare the United States with Mexico. From the standpoint of high-skill and low-skill workers, the United States has an advantage in both, an absolute advantage. It has more high-skill workers. It also has more low-skill workers. It has a bigger population. But what's important for the theory of comparative advantage is the ratio of high-skill to low-skill workers, the proportion of high-skill workers, and there it's clearly higher in the United States. That means that the United States has a comparative advantage in producing goods where high skills are called for. For example, software, computer software. By contrast, Mexico has a comparative advantage in producing those goods where high skills don't matter so much. Agricultural goods like corn might be one example. Well, in order to understand what effect globalization has on production and on inequality, let's start by imagining what production patterns would be before trade opens up. Then let's look at what happens at production after the trade barriers are removed. And the difference between the two is presumably the result of the globalization. Okay, so we'll look first at what happens in the United States and Mexico before trade is opened. In that case, American companies presumably will be producing both software and corn because both are demanded by American consumers. And Mexican companies are going to do the same because their consumers want these two sorts of goods as well. There's a sense, though, in which American corn production is inefficient because, after all, with all of these high-skilled workers around, the American labor force is better suited to produce goods which require a lot of high-skilled workers. And similarly, there's a sense in which American software production is inefficient because their labor force is better suited to produce corn. We can go a step farther and say that there's a sense in which the low-skilled Mexican workers are actually hurt by Mexican software production in the sense that they're not going to be used very much, they're not going to be employed very much in this software production, and therefore, to the extent that production is being diverted away from software, from corn to software, the demand for the low-skill workers' services is actually being depressed, is being reduced. And therefore, there's going to be a corresponding downward pressure on their wages. By the same token, the high-skilled Mexican workers greatly benefit from this software production. There aren't very many of them, and so to the extent that software production is being undertaken, there's going to be high demand for their services. So that's the situation in Mexico before globalization. Now, what happens after the door between the US and Mexico opens up? Well, it's no longer necessary for the US to produce its own corn to satisfy American demands. It can instead start importing corn from Mexico, and therefore the US will shift at least some of its production away from corn to software. And Mexico will do just the opposite. It will stop producing so much software and will shift over to corn. It will import its software from the US. The upshot of this is that Mexico is now producing more corn and less software than it was before trade was opened up with the US. And this is going to raise the demand for low-skilled workers because corn uses low-skilled workers much more intensely than does software. So the demand for low-skilled workers goes up. Correspondingly, the demand for high-skilled workers goes down because not so much software is being produced in Mexico anymore. And as a result, low-skilled wages rise, high-skilled wages fall, and inequality is reduced. That is the theory behind the promise that globalization made to reduce inequality. And as you see, it sounds pretty plausible. It certainly sounded plausible to a great deal of the economics profession. And furthermore, as I suggested at the outset, this theory has worked very well in the past. For example, in the second half of the 19th century, there was a corresponding period of globalization occurring between the United States and Europe. At that point, Europe had a relative abundance of low-skilled labor. In the US, it was high-skilled labor, which was in comparative advantage. And when trade between the US and Europe took off, as it did quite dramatically toward the end of the century, inequality fell in Europe, just as the theory had predicted. It actually also rose in the US. I'm not, for the purposes of this talk, going to dwell on increases in inequality in rich countries. My focus is on what goes on in the poorer countries of the world. At any rate, the theory worked well then, and it's worked on many other occasions as well. But it's been less successful for this recent globalization. In two ways. First of all, as I've suggested, the key to the theory is the skill ratio, the ratio between high skill and low skill workers. the theory predicts that the bigger this difference is across countries, the more these countries will benefit from trade, and therefore the more trade should actually occur. But in fact, if we compare the United States and, say, the nation of Chad rather than Mexico, we see that the skill ratios between the US and Chad are actually much greater than the US and Mexico. Mexico is a poor country, but not nearly so poor as Chad. And yet we don't see much trade between the US and Chad or most other African countries at all. The very poorest countries of the world, by and large, have been left out of globalization almost entirely, contrary to the theory. And then the other prediction, which I've already been talking about, is that the theory of comparative advantage predicts a decrease in inequality, which we just haven't seen. In fact, in many countries, such as Mexico, just the opposite has occurred. Now, not surprisingly, this increase in inequality has been picked up by people who oppose globalization. But interestingly, even many of globalization's supporters, and I'll use former President Clinton as an example, even many of these supporters acknowledge that if globalization is to help low-skill workers in poor countries, education and training will be essential. Now, nothing I said when laying out the theory of comparative advantage hinted that training and education would be important. And so if this is true, it again must be a departure from the standard theory. So in the remaining time, let me outline an alternative theory, which I've been exploring in collaboration with Michael Kremer, who's an economist at Harvard. I won't have time to show you the theory in all its ugly glory, but I can at least give you a sketch. And let me go back to the idea that globalization, among other things, has to do with an increase in international production. That's going to be the feature that I'm going to emphasize. So the Delhi call center, when you call your bank, is an example. Another example comes from the computer industry, where it's increasingly common that your computer might be designed in the US, programmed someplace in Europe, and then actually assembled someplace else, say in China. With many high-tech goods, the production process is spread over many countries. Now, in this alternative theory, it will be important that there be not just 2 skill levels, but many skill levels. For my purposes today, I'm going to concentrate on 4. And then finally, I'm going to assume that a production process consists of bringing together different tasks. You can think of some tasks as being highly sensitive to skill. Perhaps managerial tasks fall under this category. And other tasks are less sensitive to skill. Assembly line tasks, for example, subordinate tasks, I will call them. And again, for simplicity, I'm going to imagine that production consists of just 2 tasks, a skill-sensitive task and a less skill-sensitive task. As in my US-Mexico example, I'm going to concentrate on two countries, one rich, one poor. The rich country is rich because its workers have higher skill levels. I'll suppose that the skill levels in the rich country are A and B. The skill levels in the poor country are C and D, and A is bigger than B, is bigger than C, is bigger than D. So wealth is embodied in the skill level of labor for the argument I'm going to give this evening. In fact, this particular ordering of the skill levels isn't essential. What is important for the argument I'm about to give is that the high skill levels in the rich country are higher than the low skill levels in the poor country. Now, output is produced by bringing together the two tasks, the managerial task and the subordinate task, by matching managers and subordinates. And how much output is derived from such a matching will depend on the skill levels of the manager and the subordinate. Let me make a very concrete assumption about that. I'll suppose that output equals the skill level of the manager squared times the skill level of the subordinate. Now, this particular functional form is irrelevant to the results, but it gets across the idea that because the managerial skill is being squared, output depends quite sensitively on managerial skill, not as much on subordinate skill. So just as an illustration, if the managerial skill were 4, the subordinate skill were 3, we would have a total output of 4 squared times 3, or 48. Let me also assume that there are many producers. This is important to ensure that there is sufficient competition to ensure that wages are competitive and also that output prices are competitive. Now, because workers come in different skill levels, there are different possible patterns of matching that could conceivably arise. Let me illustrate by supposing that we had 2 workers of skill level 3 and 2 workers of skill level 4. I'll call the workers of skill level 3 workers and the others 4 workers as a shorthand. So one way that we could match workers is across skill levels. That is, we could match each of the three workers with a 4 worker. Presumably the 4 worker would be put in the managerial position because the managerial position is more sensitive to skill. I'll call this cross-matching, and notice that in this example it results in a total output of 4 squared times 3 for each of the matchings, and since there are 2 matchings, there'll be a total output of 96. Another possible way that the workers could be matched is homogeneously. That is, 2 workers of the same skill level could be matched, the 4 with the 4 and the 3 with the 3. In this example, that would result in a total output of 91, which is less than 96. And so, given these skill levels, we would expect that competition would result in cross-matching because that is the more efficient, the higher output arrangement. But let's suppose that instead of 3 workers and 4 workers, we had 2 workers and 4 workers. Once again, there would be 2 possible matching arrangements we might contemplate. The 2s could be matched with the 4s. That's the cross-matching arrangement. And in this case, it would result in a total output of 64. Or we could have homogeneous matching, where each 4 is matched with another 4, each 2 is matched with another 2, in this case resulting in a total output of 72. So in this case, unlike the first example, we would expect competition, the force of competition, to result in homogeneous matching. Notice that these 2 examples illustrate that there are 2 forces at work pushing in opposite directions. On the one hand, because the 2 tasks, the managerial task and the subordinate task, are differentially sensitive to skill, we tend to want cross-matching because we want to have higher skilled people in managerial positions, lower skilled people in subordinate positions, all other things being equal. So the differential skill sensitivity pushes us toward cross-matching. However, if the skill levels become too different, and in the example I showed you a moment ago, too different meant that a gap between a skill level of 2 and a skill level of 4 was already big enough to result in this effect. Homogeneous matching is better. And the reason for that is that outputs, the way that output is produced makes the 2 different tasks complementary. That is, if I'm working with you and your skill level rises, that makes me more productive too. That helps me produce more output. And therefore, if I'm a very high-skill manager and you're a very low-skill subordinate, my productivity is going to be compromised too much by being matched with you. And therefore, if our skill levels are too great, it's better to have homogeneous matching rather than cross-matching. So we see that the actual pattern of matching that we can expect to occur will strike a balance between these 2 effects. It will depend on the actual skill levels of the workers in question. So now let's go back to our rich country and our poor country. The rich country has skill levels A and B. The poor country has skill levels C and D. And to make things very concrete, let's actually assign numbers to these 4 different skill levels. So I've done that, 13, 8, 6, and 4 to A, B, C, and D. And I want to do the same kind of thought experiment pre-globalization and post-globalization for this model that I went through for the theory of comparative advantage. So now let's look at what happens before international production becomes possible, so that all production is confined within domestic boundaries. Given the numbers that I showed you on the previous slide, it's not hard to work out that in the rich country, we will find A's matched with B's, cross-matching. And in the poor countries, we will also find cross-matching, C's matched with D's. This will be the production arrangement that is most efficient prior to globalization. Now, what happens once production can cross international lines? Given the same skill levels that I showed you on the previous slide, we get an entirely different matching pattern. Now it becomes efficient for the B's and the C's to be matched across international lines. The D's will be homogeneously matched, and the A's will be homogeneously matched. What are the implications of this pre to post-globalization pattern shift? In particular, what is the effects of globalization on wages and on inequality? Well, because I'm assuming that there are many producers competing for many workers, competition will ensure that workers will be paid according to their productivity. Before globalization took place, we saw that the C workers and the D workers were cross-matched. And from the standpoint of wages, this was a very good thing for the D workers because their productivity was being enhanced by being matched with the higher level C workers. But after globalization, as we've seen, the C workers went off and matched with the B workers instead. The D workers were left to their own devices. They were left to match homogeneously. They no longer had this productivity enhancing feature of being matched with higher skill workers. And so globalization causes the D workers' wages to fall. Just the opposite happens to the C workers. Pre-globalization, they were matched with the Ds, these low-skill D workers. Post-globalization, they're matched with the much higher-skill B workers. Their productivity increases quite substantially, and their wages rise correspondingly. So the upshot of globalization in this example is quite typical, is that inequality in the poor country is aggravated. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And that's the basic mechanism of this matching theory of international trade. What can we take away from this theory from the standpoint of policy? Given that globalization in examples like this tends to aggravate inequality, what can we do about it, if anything? Well, we come back to President Clinton's suggestion that raising the skill level of these D workers so that they have the opportunity to match across international lines, or failing that, at least they have the chance to still match with the C workers, is bound to have a welcome effect on their wages. The question is, who's going to pay for this education, for this training? We might want the producers themselves to do it, but they won't have the incentive to do it, because while it's true that if they train their workers, those workers' productivity will rise, that's a good thing. But then, of course, they're going to have to pay them more, which wipes out the gain to the producer from the investment in education. We can't rely on the workers themselves to get the education either. First, they may be so poor that they can't afford to get to pay for the training. But even if they could afford it, notice that this theory predicts that if I get more training, if I get more education, I'm not going to be the only one who benefits from that. If you work with me, you will also benefit from my higher skill level through increased productivity. And since when I pay for my education, I can't capture your gain in productivity. I can't derive any benefit from your gain in productivity. If we rely on workers to pay for their own education, we're going to have underinvestment in education. This is what economists call an externality. When my action, in this case getting more education, creates a benefit for you which I cannot enjoy myself. So all that suggests that if the investment is going to occur at all, it's going to have to be done by third parties, possibly by the governments where these low-skilled workers reside, possibly by international agencies like the World Bank or NGOs, possibly foreign aid from rich countries could take the form of educational subsidies. And then finally, private foundations could get into this game too. So, to sum up, yes, the findings so far on international, on the effect of globalization on inequality in poor countries have been discouraging. But if the theory I've outlined is correct, or if some other theory resembling it is correct, and I should emphasize that there's a whole set of theories which are too new on the scene to have been thoroughly tested yet. But if some class of them proves to be on the right track, then there is indeed a clear course of action. The right response is not at all to try to stop globalization. It's not clear that it could be stopped even if we wanted it to be, but rather to allow the lower skilled workers of the world, the poorest people of the world, to share in the possible benefits of globalization by investing in their training and education. Thank you very much. So I believe that there's time for a few questions, right? Gregory.